Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Lorgar's discovery, Lorgar's Betrayal in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Index Asteroutes, Doomfists. Origins. The scattering of the Primarches was a lamentable event in Imperial history. It was an unfortunate moment, too, for the planet of Inwit. Perhaps if the seventh pod had not landed, the world would have become quite different indeed. The pod landed near the caves of the Dorn clan, and their leader took the young Primarch in. Rogal, as he was named, learned and grew quickly, and indeed the Patriarch declared the Primarch his heir when Rogal was only 5. The feast celebrating that has become forever etched into the Primarch's memory. It is the last such memory of those who raised him. Rogal's uncle, Fernat, doubted his father's decision. Arguments broke out at the celebration among those who were once close friends. Then, as the debate died down, the ceiling cracked and the entire ice cave collapsed. There was only one survivor. As Rogal Dorn climbed across the remnants of his home, he gazed at the corpses of his loved ones. They were in various stages of mutilation, but none were breathing. They had died because of a geological accident, an unstable mountain, but nothing could be further from the young Primarch's mind as he surveyed their bodies. Rogal gazed at Fernat's broken self. His uncle, the one who had doubted him, was now as dead as the rest. Their argument washed away in a tide of death. Fernat's mouth moved, one last time. "Farewell, nephew. You are the last Dorn. I doubted you, do not listen to me. You are the last Dorn, be the greatest." Fernat gave a last heaving breath and slipped into final unconsciousness. Rogal knew there were no others. His family, the only thing he cared about, was gone. Dorn swore 1,000 oaths that day, but all were soon forgotten. Even a Primarch would have had a hard time surviving in Inwishan winter without a home, and thus Dorn camped in a great metallic structure known as the Phalanx. Over time, Dorn refined his philosophy in the unheated corridors of the Phalanx. Regret was a weakness, the world simply didn't care. A single person was but a speck in the wind, and in the end all would be dust. There would be no utopia on Inwit, or anywhere else, but neither was there anything sacred in hard work. There was no point to life, but neither was there a use for despair. The universe would continue. In the unfeeling halls of the Phalanx, Dorn tampered with the building, eventually realizing its true purpose, that of a spaceship. After returning it to good condition, Dorn blasted off. Rogal had little interest in creating an empire. Rather, the seventh Primarch became a wanderer. He traversed his home world, everywhere talking of his philosophy, engaging in debates, and in the end somehow surviving. He saw much suffering below, and comforted the dying with the fact that pain, like life, was brief. At the same time, his compassion was never a driving force, as in the end Inwit lived honestly and well enough. His presence inevitably inspired hatred in some areas, but he was the last Dorn, already a giant, and he had the ship that could push the ways of Inwit forward. As inventors, among them Dorn himself, duplicated technology from the Phalanx, Inwit colonized a number of uninhabited worlds and encountered a number of inhabited ones. Rogal made special note of every philosophy and religion they met, writing their cores down and incorporating their best parts into his own beliefs. But in the end he let them be, rejecting proposals of conquest as aimless. Nevertheless, as Inwishan colonies spread, Rogal Dorn made contact with a being even more powerful than himself, and distant from his principles. The Great Crusade. The Emperor found Dorn in the halls of the Phalanx. As the giant golden figure entered the room where Dorn was writing his opus, the future first book of Dorn, Rogal turned around, and after the Emperor introduced himself, Dorn accepted command of the 7 Legion. The Emperor called himself Rogal's father, but Rogal remembered the fall of the Dorn fortress well. The Emperor had not been there, nor before or after. He appeared after Rogal had crawled out of ruins into the stars, and tried to take credit for him. Worst of all, he was an idealist. Rogal never could have had a good relationship with such a father. He knew well that the Imperium would, with time, stagnate into a mockery of itself and that the Emperor's grand dreams had no chance of becoming reality. In fact, Dorn realized the Emperor's foolishness would only accelerate the decline. Nevertheless, Dorn did not desire to go to war against a new empire. As such, the Primarch acted much as was expected. Expanding his legion, he founded the hyperboreal fortress on Inwit's surface. The phalanx remained as Dorn's personal vessel, wherein he lived and worked. Though Rogel was powerful in combat, as numerous battles against various Xenos proved, his passion was philosophy. The first book of Dorn was finished, an outline of how life should be lived, realistically and quietly, without delusions, without self-importance. The text became official ideology of the Imperial Fists. Dorn kept the name, although he would later become the only Primarch to retitle his legion at a point after his discovery, despite mild disapproval by the Emperor. At the foundation of Dorn's writings was the belief that death and evil were part of life and should be embraced. The meaning of life should be found individually by each person, but there was no single right meaning, as there was no single right morality. The details, however, provided a tree of thought intricate enough that it had to be taught to the Fists by hypno-training methods. Despite Dorn's doubts, the Imperial Fists, which quickly grew, slightly exceeding the Emperor's suggestions on size and reaching about 120,000 asteroids, continued marching across the galaxy. Inwit was kept as it was, and the Imperial Fists did not use the planet except as a recruiting ground. With time, the world fell into disrepair, and indeed regressed to a technological level much like that on Fenris. Massive wars split the globe, and philosophical debates fell away. Some have whispered that Dorn's unceasing preaching accelerated this decline, as society declined from greed and/or ennui born of misunderstanding the first book of Dorn. Dorn viewed his homeworld's constant wars and barbarism as simply the inevitable results of all great social engineering, such as what he had done to lift it up in the first place. He did not regret anything, though, as the same disorder that drove Inwit to ruin created a world of warriors, bolstering the recruit quality of the Seven Legion. It is said that when Rogel heard news that the monument to his family built on the Dorn home's former site had been ransacked, the Primarch smiled and said that if the people of Inwit had not done it, he would have done it personally. Dorn. His devotion to his family was extreme, and he mourns for them still. His logic is great too, and thus he created a philosophy from his grief, a good one. Now, his philosophy contradicts his grief, and he chooses philosophy. It is only the correct choice. Captain Alexis Pollux. Rogel Dorn had few true friends. He saw many of the other Primarches as idealistic morons who would sacrifice themselves to protect the Imperium, in Dorn's opinion, a supremely futile gesture, symbolizing the absurdity of heroism. Rogel Dorn did stay friends with Horus. Despite some differences in philosophy, Horus supported the freedom and importance of choice much more than Rogel, who viewed choice as being most often irrelevant. The last Dorn also kept up a good relationship with Fukin, who still remembered his family, as well as with Robot Guilliman in similar situations. Nevertheless, the Emperor ostracized him, either due to philosophy or due to other aspects of his character, and even these brothers talked to him less and less with time. Rogel's greatest arguments might have been with Fulgrim. The son of Chemos had been raised in a horrible environment, but insisted perfection and unlimited success were possible. Indeed, Fulgrim's friendship with Guilliman was one of the main isolating factors between the 7 and the 13. The Lion and Ferrus Manus also opposed Dorn on philosophical grounds, both insisting humanity would endure. Rogel nevertheless never felt hate for them, rather seeing them as naive. Perturabo, contrarily, was a good friend of Rogel's, and the 7 Primarch aided the writing of the Book of Perturabo, analyzing the morality and mental effects of war and killing. Nevertheless, even Perturabo was seen as somewhat too idealistic by Dorn. The 4 Primarch was searching for a singular meaning, an impossible search. For all of his non-martial focus, though, Dorn was still a mighty warrior. On the world of Lop, he dealt with a massive host of orcs for the first time. The Green Xenos had no grasp of military strategy, and after gaining air superiority and learning of the Xenos' biology, causing a large rise in the number of flamers being produced in the hyperboreal fortress armories, the 7th eliminated the threat with 0 casualties. Over the gas giant of Kebfr, the local Xenos had forged an alliance with a small human republic. Via propaganda and a few well-placed attacks, that friendship was sundered and the Imperium took over the civilization's ruins. Nevertheless, as the crusade continued, with every conquered world increasing the size of the inevitable disaster that would follow it, Dorn sunk deeper into despair with every day. He began referring to the truth he had formulated, as a heavy burden. He began retreating into the phalanx more and more with each day. Eventually, after a cache of ancient weapons was uncovered by an Inwishan tribe and the planet plunged into a winter worse than had ever before been seen, Dorn hid himself in the central rooms of the phalanx and allowed it to float on the currents of the warp, searching for death or epiphany. The Great Betrayal. Dorn met the Chaos Gods in their home. When, during his travels, he saw the phalanx Geller fields breaking down, he simply looked at the disaster unfolding calmly. The Warp Gods were quite impressed with Dorn, and the Daemongajvr told the lost Primarch of the truth of chaos. Dorn saw then the way out of his dilemma. There was evil, and indeed evil was inherent and constant, but good existed too, also constant. To oversimplify, Dorn found good in truth, and evil in denial. An essential aspect of this was that with chaos, belief became in some sense grounded, for beliefs in and of themselves have power in the warp, and Dorn's ironclad system did as well. Perhaps that is what allowed him to survive the impossibility of chaos then, as a Primarch. Thus, of course, the benevolent Imperium was the evilest of all. Convinced that they were doing good, they destroyed all sorts of true beliefs. Inspired by this, Dorn began planning to release humanity from its enslavement. Even after he returned to his legion and now dead world of Inwit, he often conferred with the Warp Gods. Rogel did not immediately reveal his discoveries to the legion, but rather slowly disseminated them among those he could trust. Captains such as Halbrecht and Sigismund flocked to this new ideal. Still, only perhaps 10% of the Imperial Fists knew the full nature of the Chaos Gods and the essence of reality, the others remained in the dark, for now. The Hyperboreal Fortress remained the Legion's home in this time, but as Inwit was no longer inhabitable, other worlds began to provide all of the Fist's recruits. During this phase, Rogel wrote the second book of Dorn. He also became even closer friends with Horus. More than anything, he realized the importance of choice here, the choice in the space of the Chaos Gods. Choices outside that range, such as the decision to follow the Imperium, led to damnation and therefore were inferior, though, of course, it was too early to risk revealing himself. Then, Lorgar was persecuted. After he broke, Dorn visited his former rival and found it almost disturbingly easy to turn Lorgar to chaos. When Rogel discovered that Lorgar's second-in-command, Corphaeron, also knew the blessings of chaos, the conversion of the word-bearers was a sure thing. The agents of the gods traveled the Legion's length during this time, and indeed many planets too fell under Dorn's sway. Nevertheless, Rogel knew that open rebellion would have to come sometime. Lorgar sent embassies to the legions that Dorn assumed would join them. Rogel, though the architect of the rebellion, stayed in the background here. He was a man of thought more than of action, and thus he inspired the movement more than he led it. The Discoverers, as Lorgar had titled their rebellion, gathered around the world of Istvan III, sending down those who could not be turned to the gods onto the surface to be bombed. Regrettably, a number of mistakes took place there, and after it was declared the forces stationed on the surface would be destroyed, Dorn's own son, Alexis Pollux, raised the flag of counter-revolt. Pollux had always believed in the ultimate good of the Emperor, but Dorn had assumed his logic was greater and would turn him to the side that clearly had overwhelming local force and the correct perspective. Instead, Pollux led a number of ships in assaulting the Seven Legion's own fleet. Brother fought brother for the first time in these hallways, and both sides hardened against those which had been their friends. In the end, regrettably, Pollux escaped with a contingent of Imperial warriors towards Terra. By then, Dorn had already been told that the embassies to Horus and Conrad Kurz had failed. Though upset by Horus' betrayal of their friendship and of his principles, Rogel was not disheartened. If the fleets would make a beeline for Terra, which they did, the Discoverers could eliminate the Mad Emperor himself before the larger opposition had a chance to successfully react. The Imperial Fists chose to go with the Iron Warriors, White Scars, and Salamanders as the first fleet. The ships blasted off from Istvan and made quick progress through the warp, aided by the gods. The first fleet arrived at Terra in a matter of months, even conquering a few planets along the way. In this journey, Dorn renamed his legion the Doom Fists, dropping the hated adjective. About 97,000 Doom Fists arrived at Terra. The rest had either been unable to reach the gathering point at Istvan due to other assignments, betrayed their Primarch and chosen the easy route, or died fighting those that did. Surprisingly, though, Even the fast movement of the First Fleet was not quick enough to find an undefended Imperial palace. The Ultramarines and the Emperor's children, along with some of the Raven Guard, crewed the palace walls. The first attacks were repulsed, but as Dorn strove to reorganize his forces, he saw major issues in organization. Naturally strict, Rogel could not be happy when Perturabo beat on the palace walls without orders, if somewhat successfully, and even less happy that Jagatai Khan basically ignored the siege, instead making isolated raids. Fukin alone didn't disobey orders on a daily basis, but even those Nergalite troops didn't always follow the 7 Primarchas' commands. Finally, after prolonged bombing, which caused heavy losses in Perturabo's soldiers, the Doomfists rushed towards the Imperial Palace. The shields were almost down, and further bombardment could open the gates. Except there was no further bombardment. The orbital superiority so quickly gained by the Discoverers was equally quickly broken by the arrival of a new legion, Mortarian's Death Guard. The Imperial forces easily won the space battle, in large part because the Air Force hiding inside the Imperial Palace took off and assisted them. Following the taking of orbit, the Death Guard landed on Terran soil and encircled the invaders. Dorn was never a supporter of retreats, but he had long since learned that honorable concepts like fighting to the bitter end had no place in a callous world. The Doomfists scattered. "I cannot surrender. I will not surrender. We will return, and the palace will tremble before us. Now is not the time for such an assault, though. The Imperium will pay in blood, it just won't pay today." Rogel Dorn. The Legion was picked up by the forces of the Second Fleet when they arrived, far too late. Nevertheless, Dorn's Legion had in large part survived, with about 40,000 still holding the banner of Chaos high. After their defeat at the palace itself, the Fists Primarch had constructed a small fortress that had held back the Loyalists' forces for the entire duration. Dorn, after abandoning it, ordered it burned to the ground. The escape. When Dorn learned that Lorgar and the Emperor were both dead, he ordered another retreat, this time to the Eye of Terror. It was clear to Rogel that the war was lost, too few legions were left on their side, and too many were coming to help the Imperials. Thus, Dorn turned his eyes towards the Eye, and left for there along with the Iron Warriors. The warp journey did not take too long, even with the smaller incursions involved. Nevertheless, the Council of Warsmiths had a desire to see the Imperium bleed for its evil, and for once Rogel couldn't disagree. Obscurus would cry in pain, and perhaps then, the Imperium could at last see the arbitrary flickers of existence. The 7 Primarch sent his champion Halbrecht into the Eye of Terror with half of the Legion, ordering them to set up camp, and personally led the Doomfists into what became known as the Iron Cage Campaign, for its stated goal of turning Segmentum Obscurus into an iron cage of chaotic torment. The campaign began successfully, with most of the area near the Kadayan Gate taken and fortified. The ultimate opposition that ruined the assault was not the Imperial Astaroth's forces, rather, it was mere humans that prevented the Iron Cage. The Imperial army of assaulted planets fought to the death, even without officers. Civilians behind the front hid in the wilderness. Those that were caught and enslaved did as much damage as they could. Dorn's directives and the advice of Chaos didn't help. The campaign was stagnating. Then, the resistance organized. The partisans and slave revolts didn't stop, but the Imperial army came under the sway of one Kurioi Kreen. She led several planets to mount a full-scale invasion on the worlds of Chaos. Dorn's front fell back under skillful bombardment and armored assault. Fortunately, Astaroths know no fear. As the humans overreached, the Iron Warriors and Doomfists stood their ground. The retaken planets were barren wastelands anyway. After Captain Sigismund killed Kreen in an assault on her headquarters ship, the Imperial offensive stopped. The last Dorn was, of course, shocked by the Imperium's capability for denial. Freedom was staring them in the face, but they refused to acknowledge reality, instead believing in an emperor whom Lorgar had personally killed. Their resolve was beyond ridiculous, but over the years of stalemate Dorn could not find a way to break it. Though retreats had been stopped, the Chaos Legions saw no way to win. Daemons were summoned, though the Council of Warsmiths forbid those of any god besides Kern, but they slowly lost interest in trench warfare. The finishing touch on the Iron Cage mess, when the campaign was already lost, was the arrival of the fresh Death Guard. Taking over for the mortals, they obliterated the new strategies thrust by Dorn onto them. They pursued the broken 4 and 7 to Kadaya itself, and the infuriated Mortarion personally boarded the phalanx. The clash between the two Primarches was legendary, and only Dorn's pleadings with Mortarion's first captain Ignatius Grulgar allowed him to finish off the Dusk Prince. Still, Mortarion's dying fury not only crashed the phalanx into the surface of Kadaya, but also broke the demonic from a number of worlds near Kadaya. Rogel himself only barely escaped the falling ship by an emergency teleporter. The Long War. Since the death of his father, Rogel's goal has been simple: to show the galaxy the true power of his beliefs. The existence of the Imperium has been a constant annoyance, but non-Chaos Xenos have found no love from him either. Ironically, with time Rogel has come to embrace Horus' stance on the importance of freedom. The freedom to choose one's own path was the thing separating humans from animals, and from daemons. That is, freedom was not present at either of the two extremes of life, but rather determined one's fate at either extreme. Regardless of philosophy, though, the Seven Legion has been at the forefront of any fighting it has participated in. In any conflicts against those they believe can or should be turned, the Doomfists use propaganda heavily as well. Perhaps the best-known campaign of the Doomfists against a non-human foe was Dorn's invasion of craft world Altensar. Many on the Eldar super spaceship were turned to chaos, but few were killed. Admittedly, some of the converts were already secretly cultists due to Altensar's long time stuck in the eye. The remnants, a small minority of the craft world's population, were shot out of the eye by sorcerers, as Dorn decided they were of more use causing strife between their kind than as sacrifices to chaos. Sigismund has pursued a quite distinct goal. The Divine Champion, as he prefers to be called, has led 60 failed attacks against Kadaya, Black Crusades, seeking to regain what the Iron Cage campaign had lost. Some worlds have been captured, but others have been cleansed by the Imperium. While the early Crusades did make progress, the past millennium has seen the 5 least successful of all Sigismund's wars, and some consider it surprising that the gods have not yet rejected him. Sigismund made his way to Dorn. He had heard Dorn was going to banish him from the Legion. This could not be allowed. Despite the inconsistent results of his campaigns, Sigismund was of value. He was a living symbol of what the Doomfists stood for. Never once had he wandered from the philosophy of Dornism. Gene Father. The Daemon Primarch turned. Do not worry, Sigismund. I will not banish you. You amuse us too much. The Primarch himself has become a Daemon Prince. His appearance is now that of a great yellow sun, giving off much light yet no heat. From it springs, on a yellow snake's neck, the head. 7 black hands, doubling as feet, propel the Daemon Primarch. Nevertheless, Dorn continues to play a large part in his legion's functioning, and besides publishing thousands of addendums to the Second Book of Dorn, he has played part in many military actions. Among those was the Siege of Krieg. When the Autarch of Krieg discovered the Chaos Gods, the Imperium responded by attempting to exterminate all life on the world. It may or may not have been Colonel Jordan of the Krieg 83rd who chose to destroy the once prosperous planet. In any case, it was not the act of anyone sane. The Doomfists joined the action, as did the Night Lords, on the other side. In the end, Krieg was reduced to a wasteland by a start combat and bombardment. Though the Night Lords did eventually cause their foes to retreat, they did so with greater losses than the Doomfists. To this day, it is unclear why they would have sacrificed so much for only a few ragtag groups of humans. Nevertheless, the Doomfists continue to roam the galaxy, for their Primarch, their gods, and their philosophy. They are and will remain the most convinced of the forces of chaos, and the only ones who realize its true heart. Organization. During the Great Crusade, the Doomfists were organized into companies. Since then, the Legion has never stalwartly followed one organizational principle, but rather allowed captains to control their own sections of the Legion. The majority of the Doomfists fall into one of 3 groups: Catalfix, Sigismunds, and the rest. Dorn equally spends his time on each group. Demetrius Catalfic's group, inherited from Halbrecht after the latter captain fell in battle, is largely made up of those legionaries that considered the Iron Cage a worthless exercise in which Dorn forgot his own philosophy and assumed everything would go well. Before the campaign, this group was small and didn't even include Catalfici, who specifically complained about not being allowed to fight. Since, it has grown into a bulwark of conservatism. This group is the one where the first book of Dorn is read, and even revered on par with the second. It believes every plan will break down, and that the only way to deal with one's inevitable failure is to have successes to even one's enemies fail, after all. This group is generally less devout than the others, and even might have some unbelievers in its ranks. Its stated mission is defending the Eye of Terror and dealing, often violently, with other Chaos Legions. Catalfaki keeps his Asteroutes organized into 6 great companies of about 10,000 each, which are led by a captain and further consistently organized only on the squad level with sergeants, 1,000 squads per great company. Sigismund's group is the opposite. Though their organization is the same, having only 3 great companies, all decreasing in size recently, the goals of the Black Crusaders is to take the Mort Ariel worlds and turn them back to the daemons. They are more religious in their philosophy, and have reminded some onlookers of the word-bearers with their devoutness and mercilessness. In fact, the first book of Dorn is viewed as only a rough draft. This organization is failing, just like Sigismund's latest crusades, though it will not go away anytime soon. It is quite likely that Sigismund's power will truly decrease. Already, some reformers have founded free companies from the Crusaders. The free companies are 343 Astarte, at full strength, groups that make up the rest of the Legion. There are approximately 100 of them, each with no number but rather a name. They roam galaxy-wide for recruits and loot, but personal interpretations of Dorn vary between captains. The only thing this group truly has in common is a preference of Dorn over his 2 most prominent subordinates. Combat Doctrine. The Doomfists believe their mission is to illuminate the masses. Propaganda is used heavily before the invasion, in which drop pods land and the Fists simply take over. The details depend on the commander, of course. Often the Fists will show mercy, as they believe the galaxy should be inhabited under chaos, not only by daemons. Other times, they will simply burn a planet down to make a point. Regardless, the Fists are not likely to ally themselves with cults, and do so grudgingly even with other Chaos Legions, though the Iron Warriors are frequent allies. When their help is requested, though, they will come, in the process turning the outpouring of curiosity that a cult is into a Dornist structure. Some have claimed that Rogel means to become a 5th Chaos God through such organizations. Those are in their majority Imperial scholars with no direct connection to the Daemon Primarch, as he has repeatedly denied any such ideas. The Fists have a passion for defensive siege warfare, holding Daemon and cultist worlds from Imperial attack. This is probably the main reasons anyone outside their organization might call on them. It should be noted, however, that a Dornist fortress will not be a chaotic utopia, rather focused entirely on the attacker's elimination. After all, utopia can only be a dream. The Doomfists prefer neither close nor ranged combat specifically. Each member is taught to be proficient in both, at least in principle, though the choice of weapons is a personal matter. There is an emphasis, in any case, on individual excellence, as compared to the word-bearers and Iron Hands, which also use propaganda and espionage more often than direct combat. The Doomfists make more effort to ensure they are fully capable of that combat when necessary. Tactics, by contrast, are less emphasized, due to the quirks of the Doomfists' discipline. There are squads composed entirely of raptors, havocs, devotees of a certain god or sorcerers, along with those containing none of these. Sergeants typically have a certain amount of control over these things. The Doomfists frown on the use of possessed marines, though, seeing them as fusing 2 beings of worth into one and thus equivalent to a casualty. Homeworld. Before the discovery, the 7th homeworld was named Inwit. Under Rogeldorn, it prospered, but as time went on the general organization faded and barbarism ran rampant. Rogel announced that he wouldn't be bothered with this, that there was nothing wrong with it, and that the undeserving would die in any case. Thus, Inwit declined, though the quality of Fists aspirants rose with frequency of battles. In the end, the low technological level led to a nuclear war. When a cache of truly ancient weapons was uncovered by an unknown tribe, the world became a nuclear wasteland. The populace froze to extinction, and Inwit became a dead world. The Doomfists continued recruiting from other worlds that Dorn visited before he met the Emperor and that practiced his philosophy. It was not even Rogel who told the Emperor of his homeworld's ruin. Since the discovery, the Doomfists do not have a single set homeworld, rather recruiting from the entirety of their holdings in the Eye. Moreover, recruits often come from worlds the Fists fight on outside the Eye. They never recruit the unwilling, though. Dorn does not desire any fools within his legion, nor those that would forsake chaos. This decision means that much of the Fist's membership is filled with chaos even before entering the 7th. No. He was illuminated too late. The lies of the Emperor run deep within his soul, and thus he will turn back to them to some point or other. Kill this Lysander, if you can. And if you cannot, well, then it is him I will have to discuss the issue with. Vladimir Pugh, captain of the Imperium's Death-Free Company. Beliefs. The Doomfists are not devoted, as a legion, to a single chaos god, but place the choice of which one to follow, for followers, as a key part of existence. Nevertheless, those that choose undivided are respected too. After all, Rogeldorn made precisely that choice. The Doomfists believe there is no good and evil, but there is truth and falsehood. Most notably, though they refuse to condemn any choice as evil, they hold self-deceit to be an utterly destructive and hurtful impulse. Any who do not follow chaos are seen as focusing on this lie, as they deny the existence or power of the gods themselves. Many details on these can be found in the first and second books of Dorn, but in the end these are quite elaborate, and at a basic level appear to be contradictory, though further study can reveal that to not be the case. Only the base of Dorn's philosophy is consistent across the Legion. Gene seed. The Doomfist's gene seed is mildly affected by chaos, most prominently noted in spontaneous mutations of the hands. Additionally, the Susan membrane and Becher's gland are lacking, though it is unclear whether this is a mutation or merely the result of apothecary carelessness. Battle cry. Your lies end now. 999.M41. Rogeldorn looked at the circles of frost floating in the air. The light played with them, creating geometric patterns lesser beings would consider wondrous. Dorn was above such things. He lay before the ice statue, contemplating not beauty but truth. The statue, which he had personally carved 10 millennia ago, was of Fernat Dorn, the last known representation of any member of Rogel's clan besides himself. It was a statue intimately tied to Dorn's own past in Ascension, and though it no longer held any significance to him, he still preferred not to destroy it. One half of the reason was that such mementos held relevance for the power of daemons. The other was that he feared the loss of knowledge. It was, anyhow, irrelevant. The true problem lay elsewhere. Dorn had suspected, for a while, that chaos was not the ultimate representation of the warp's possibilities. After all, there were only 4 of the so-called gods. And now he had found the truth. And, for the first time in his life and transcendence, he was not sure that it was a good thing. It was a distinct possibility, by no means guaranteed, even now, because the idea had been contained in Rogeldorn's demonic mind. The idea of perspective. And if that idea was ever fully understood by the denizens of real space, then real space would end, and the warp with or without it. There is no good or evil, Rogeldorn said aloud. Destroying all things would not be good, just like it would not be evil. And yet, one day, there was the distinct possibility he would have the chance to use this information bomb. But for once, being struck with the contagion that was the full understanding of everything, Dorn could not make up his mind whether he wanted to or not. Good and evil were matters of perspective. Joy and ennui were matters of perspective. And now, Dorn could not deny that truth and falsehood were, too. Check the description for the links to the author.